They came with badges, boots, and certainty. They left with questions they could never outrun. At 3 a.m., the quiet cul-de-sac on Willow Creek Drive slept under a thin spring rain. Porch lights glowed softly across trimmed lawns, and the only sound was the distant hum of tires on wet pavement. Then red and blue light spilled across the houses like a warning no one had asked for. Dark SUVs rolled to a stop in front of a two-story brick home at the end of the street. Doors opened fast. Voices cut through the night. Heavy footsteps crossed the driveway with the kind of urgency that assumes it is right. Inside the house, Vanessa Cole woke to the sharp echo of wood splintering downstairs. Her eyes opened instantly. No confusion. No panic. Just stillness. Another crash followed, louder this time, followed by men shouting commands from behind walls they had no permission to know. She rose from bed, pulled a robe around her shoulders, and stepped into the hallway as beams of flashlight swept across framed photographs and family portraits. A voice thundered from below. "Police? Stay where you are." Vanessa placed one hand on the stair rail and looked down into her own living room as strangers flooded it like they belonged there. Officer Daniel Mercer stood in the center of the room, broad shoulders squared, rain on his jacket, jaw clenched with the confidence of a man who had kicked in many doors and never doubted one of them. Beside him, Officer Ryan Holt was already opening drawers, scanning shelves, moving through the room with fast hands and faster assumptions. "Hands where we can see them," Mercer barked. Vanessa slowly raised her hands chest high. Her voice, when it came, was calm enough to make the room feel louder. "You're in the wrong house." Holt laughed under his breath. "They all say that." Outside, curtains shifted all along the street. Front doors cracked open. Phones appeared in the dark like tiny moons. Neighbors who had waved to Vanessa for years now watched her home become a spectacle in less than 60 seconds. Mercer climbed halfway up the stairs and stopped, looking at her as if he had already decided everything that mattered. "Vanessa Cole," he asked. "Yes," she said. "Then come down here." She descended one step at a time, barefoot on polished wood, never rushing, never pleading. The officers expected fear. They expected anger. They expected excuses. What they did not expect was composure so complete it unsettled the room. Holt brushed past her toward the second floor. "Search every room," Mercer ordered. "Check closets, office, basement. Move." Vanessa reached the final step and looked at the shattered front door hanging crooked on its hinges. Rain drifted in through the opening. Cold air moved across the floor. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked. Mercer ignored the question. "Where is it?" "Where is what?" "The evidence." Vanessa studied his face for a moment, then glanced toward the kitchen clock. 3:04 a.m. officer, she said softly, "This mistake is going to cost more than that door." Mercer smirked. "You threatening law enforcement?" "No," she replied. "I'm warning you." A murmur rippled outside as more neighbors gathered under umbrellas and porch awnings. Someone began recording from across the street. Holt shouted from upstairs. "Got a locked office." Mercer turned toward the hallway. "Open it." Vanessa's eyes followed him, steady and unreadable. "Please," she said, almost politely. "Keep recording." For the first time, Mercer hesitated. Only for a second. But in rooms built on power, a second can feel like thunder. Upstairs, a door swung open. Papers scattered. A long silence followed. Then Holt's voice came back changed, stripped of swagger. "Mercer, you need to see this." Vanessa did not smile. She did not move. She only looked at the broken doorway where the whole neighborhood stood watching, and waited for the truth to walk downstairs. Mercer took the stairs two at a time, but the confidence he wore on the way up did not return with him. Vanessa heard drawers closing, footsteps slowing, voices dropping into whispers that no longer sounded in control. The neighbors outside leaned closer beneath umbrellas as rain tapped against the hedges and pooled along the curb. Every second stretched. Holt appeared first at the top landing, holding a thick black folder with both hands as if it suddenly weighed more than it should. His face had lost the hard edge it carried minutes earlier. Mercer followed behind him, eyes fixed on the papers, jaw working silently. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Vanessa for a long moment before speaking. "What is this?" he asked. Vanessa glanced at the folder and then back to him. "You entered my office without a warrant," she said evenly. "That is what it is." Holt swallowed. The folder had bold federal markings stamped across the front. Inside were sealed case summaries, timelines, internal memorandums, and a stack of names highlighted in yellow. Some belonged to contractors. Some belonged to city officials. One belonged to Officer Daniel Mercer. Outside, someone whispered loud enough to carry through the broken doorway. "Oh my God!" Mercer snapped the folder shut and turned toward the street. "Everyone back inside your homes," he shouted, but the command landed weakly in the rain. Phone stayed raised. Curtains stayed open. The neighborhood had already seen too much to unsee it now. Vanessa walked past him into the kitchen with slow, measured steps and set a kettle on the stove as if this were an inconvenience, not a crisis. Holt stared after her. "She is making tea," he muttered. "Because unlike you," Vanessa said without turning around, "I know how this night ends." Mercer stepped into the kitchen doorway. "You need to explain why my name is in that file." Vanessa faced him then, composed, alert, and entirely unafraid. "No," she said. "I do not need to explain anything to you. But I imagine federal investigators will." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Investigators?" She nodded toward the counter where her phone rested beside a leather briefcase. The screen lit with missed calls and one new message. She checked the time. 3:11 a.m. They are early, she said. Holt looked at Mercer. "Sir," Mercer cut him off. "Nobody says another word." But silence had already changed sides. The officers who entered with quick movements now stood still. The men who had searched drawers and closets now avoided touching anything at all. One patrol officer quietly stepped backward from the living room rug as if even the floor might be evidence. Vanessa poured hot water into a mug, added a tea bag, and looked toward the open front door. "You might want to close that," she said. "Rain damages hardwood." Holt rushed to lift the broken slab into place, but it sagged crooked in the frame. Another ripple of laughter came from outside, followed by the glow of more cameras. Mercer's ears reddened. Then headlights turned the street silver. A dark sedan rolled in behind the police SUVs, followed by two more vehicles with government plates. No sirens. No drama. Just precision. Doors opened. Men and women in dark coats stepped out carrying folders, tablets, and expressions that did not need introductions. The tallest among them approached the porch and displayed credentials no one challenged. Agent Thomas Reed crossed the threshold without hurry, taking in the shattered door, the wet footprints, the scattered papers, and the uniformed officers frozen in the room. "Assistant United States Attorney Cole," he said, giving Vanessa a respectful nod. "Sorry for the delay." Mercer straightened. "This is a police operation." Reed looked at him once, then at the folder in Holt's hands. "Not anymore." Vanessa lifted her mug, steam curling into the cold air. "Good," she said softly. "Now we can begin." The room changed in ways no one could measure. 5 minutes earlier it had belonged to uniforms, commands, and assumptions. Now it belonged to paperwork, silence, and consequences. Agent Thomas Reed stepped farther inside while two members of his team photographed the damaged doorway, the muddy footprints, and the drawers left hanging open throughout the house. Another agent collected body camera units one by one with calm, practiced hands. No one resisted. Even the officers who had arrived with sharp voices now spoke in careful whispers, as if volume itself had become dangerous. Vanessa stood at the kitchen island, one hand wrapped around her mug, watching the shift with the patience of someone who had waited months for this exact moment. Reed opened the black folder Holt had found upstairs and reviewed the first page. Operation Lantern, he said quietly. Active Federal Corruption Inquiry. Restricted. Access. He looked up at Mercer. Tell me why a local tactical team entered the lead prosecutor's residence before sunrise. Mercer straightened his jacket and searched for authority that no longer fit him. We received credible information regarding evidence destruction. Reed did not blink. From whom? Mercer hesitated. Confidential source. Reed nodded once. Convenient. Vanessa set her mug down. The same anonymous source who tipped your department 3 times in 6 weeks whenever subpoenas were about to be served. Mercer glanced at her sharply. She continued before he could answer. The same source who always seemed to know what our task force was doing, yet somehow only targeted witnesses connected to police misconduct cases. Holt slowly turned toward Mercer. It was the first time that night he looked at his commander like a stranger. Rain continued outside, steady and cold. Neighbors remained gathered under porch roofs and umbrellas, their phones capturing every minute. No one wanted to miss what happened when power slipped in public. Reed handed the folder to an agent beside him. Secure all devices used in tonight's operation. Mercer stepped forward. You cannot seize department property without notice. Reed met his eyes. Watch me. The words were quiet, but they landed harder than shouting ever could. In the living room, one patrol officer removed his badge clip from his belt and stared at it like it might explain how he got there. Another officer asked for legal representation in a voice barely above a whisper. Holt stood near the staircase, pale and rigid, replaying every order he had followed. Vanessa noticed him first. Officer Holt, she said. He looked up immediately. Did you know whose house this was? No, he said. Did you ask? He lowered his eyes. No, Did you read the warrant before entering? He swallowed. We were told to move fast. Vanessa nodded once. That is how shortcuts usually begin. Mercer's face tightened. You are turning my team against me. No, Vanessa replied. Truth is doing that. Reed walked to the kitchen counter where Vanessa's phone still rested. He glanced at the message on the screen and gave a slight smile. Judge signed the emergency order at 2:47 a.m. Internal monitoring was already authorized. Mercer froze. Monitoring. Reed looked toward the ceiling corners, then toward the front porch camera above the broken door. You chose to raid the one house on this street with federal surveillance support. A low murmur moved through the room. Holt exhaled like the air had been knocked out of him. Vanessa lifted the leather briefcase from the counter and opened it. Inside were duplicate files, sealed warrants, and a printed list of scheduled arrests for dawn. She placed the top page on the island. 4 names were visible. Daniel Mercer was first. You were never the hunter tonight, she said. You were the clock. Outside, another set of headlights turned into the cul-de-sac. This time they were news vans. The street outside no longer looked like a quiet suburban block. Satellite vans lined the curb beside patrol SUVs, their rooftop dishes turning slowly in the rain like machines searching for signal and scandal at the same time. Camera lights flashed through windows that had once held only curtains and family photos. Reporters stood behind hedges and mailboxes speaking in urgent voices about corruption, wrongful entry, and a federal operation unfolding in real time. Inside the house, no one moved quickly anymore. Speed had belonged to the first hour. Now everything happened with measured hands and written records. Agent Reed directed 2 investigators toward the dining room table, where laptops, radios, and confiscated devices were arranged in neat rows. Another agent escorted officers one by one to separate corners of the home for statements. The same men who had entered in formation now stood apart, each alone with his own choices. Mercer remained near the living room fireplace, shoulders squared out of habit more than confidence. He watched the news cameras outside and knew this story had already escaped every room he could control. "This is theater," he said bitterly. "You wanted headlines." Vanessa stood by the front window, looking at the reflection of lights across the wet street. "No," she said. "I wanted records. Headlines are just what happens when records become public." Mercer laughed once, but there was no strength in it. "You set me up." Vanessa turned to face him. "You were under investigation for 14 months. Misused warrants. Selective enforcement. Leaked witness names. Missing evidence logged as clerical error. No one forced you to build that file." Holt, standing nearby with an investigator, closed his eyes for a moment. He had heard rumors for years, but rumors become heavier when spoken plainly. Reed approached Mercer holding a tablet. "Phone logs place your personal number in contact with a private security consultant tied to 2 sealed cases. You want to explain that now or later?" Mercer looked at the screen, then at Vanessa. "You used her house as bait." "No," Reed replied. "We protected her house because we expected you to make a desperate move." Silence followed, thick and undeniable. In the kitchen, Vanessa quietly replaced the broken tea mug that had cracked near the sink. The small sound of ceramic touching the counter somehow carried farther than shouting had earlier. Outside, neighbors still watched. Mrs. Donnelly from across the street stepped onto her porch in slippers and handed umbrellas to 2 younger families. Mr. Alvarez next door shook his head slowly, remembering every time Vanessa had helped bring in his packages when he worked late shifts. They had known her as polite, private, dependable. Tonight they were learning she carried a title larger than the neighborhood knew and a burden heavier than any of them guessed. Reed received a call, listened, then nodded. "Judge approved the secondary warrants," he said. "Finance office, records division, and Mercer's storage unit." Mercer's expression tightened. "You cannot keep expanding this." "We are not expanding," Reed said calmly. "We are uncovering." Holt finally stepped forward. His voice trembled, but he did not hide it. "Sir, did you know the warrant address was flagged?" Mercer stared at him. "Watch yourself." Holt did not back down. "Did you know?" The room waited. Mercer said nothing. And in that silence, every officer present heard the answer. Vanessa picked up her briefcase and walked toward the staircase. "My guest room is intact," she said to Reed. "Use it for interviews." Then she paused beside Holt. "Truth gets expensive before it gets free," she said softly. "Decide what you can afford." Holt nodded, shaken. As Vanessa climbed the stairs, dawn began to gray the sky beyond the broken doorway. Night had given Mercer cover for years. Morning had arrived all at once. Dawn settled over Willow Creek Drive with the slow honesty only morning can bring. The flashing lights looked smaller now. The rain had thinned to a mist, and what had felt like a midnight operation now looked like something else entirely, a mistake too public to hide and too large to explain away. Inside the house, Agent Reed had turned the dining room into a command center. Laptops glowed across the polished table. Evidence bags were labeled in neat rows. Officers who once stood shoulder to shoulder now waited separately, each watched by an investigator with a notepad and patient eyes. Vanessa returned downstairs in a navy suit, hair pulled back, briefcase in hand. She no longer looked like someone startled awake in the middle of the night. She looked exactly like what she was, a federal prosecutor arriving early for work. The room felt it immediately. Conversations lowered. Postures changed. Even the agents who already knew her title straightened instinctively. Mercer noticed too, and something in his expression hardened into resentment. "You enjoy this?" he asked. Vanessa adjusted a folder beneath her arm. "No," she said. "I enjoy when the truth stops waiting." Reed stepped from the dining room carrying printed transcripts. "We pulled dispatch audio," he said. "The warrant request was submitted at 1:52 a.m. signed at 2:11 a.m. based on an affidavit containing 3 statements now proven false." He placed the papers on the coffee table. All three trace back to your unit. Mercer looked at the pages but did not touch them. You are twisting procedure into politics. Reed almost smiled. Procedure is what keeps power from becoming politics. Outside, reporters had multiplied. Microphones hovered near the sidewalk while neighbors gave interviews in robes, jackets, and house shoes. Mrs. Donnelly pointed toward Vanessa's home and described her as kind, quiet, always the first to shovel snow from the shared walkway in winter. Mr. Alvarez said he had trusted police his whole life until he watched them break into the wrong home before sunrise. Every sentence moved the story farther beyond Mercer's reach. Holt sat at the kitchen table across from an investigator, hands folded tight. He looked exhausted in the gray light. Vanessa approached and placed a bottle of water near him. He stared at it before speaking. I should have read the warrant. Yes, she said. You should have. I thought loyalty meant moving when ordered. Vanessa pulled out the chair opposite him and Saturday loyalty to a person is easy. Loyalty to principle costs more. Holt swallowed hard. If I cooperate, they will call me a traitor. If you stay silent, she replied, you will call yourself one. In the living room, Mercer asked for his phone. Reed declined. Mercer asked for a union representative. Reed said one was already on the way. Mercer asked if he was under arrest. Reed answered with careful precision. At this moment, you are detained pending federal review. The words landed like a door closing softly but permanently. An investigator entered from the garage carrying a small lockbox. Found in the trunk of Unit 12, she said. Inside were cash bundles, gift cards, and copies of sealed witness addresses. The room went still. Holt looked up slowly, horror replacing confusion. Mercer said nothing. Vanessa stood. Those addresses belonged to people who trusted the system enough to speak. Reed opened the box, then shut it again. Not anymore, he said quietly. Another vehicle pulled into the driveway. This one was plain, unmarked, and carrying the city police chief. He stepped out, saw the cameras, the agents, the shattered door, and paused before entering. Some scenes explain themselves. Vanessa looked at Mercer one last time and said, night protected you. Morning is less forgiving. The city police chief entered without escort, carrying the kind of silence that only comes when rank meets scandal. Chief Harold Bennett was a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired. Careful-eyed, with a reputation built on steady hands and controlled headlines. This morning he had neither. He paused in the doorway, taking in the splintered frame, the camera crews beyond the lawn, the federal agents moving through the house, and Officer Daniel Mercer standing alone near the fireplace like a monument already scheduled for removal. Tell me this is not what it looks like, Bennett said quietly. No one answered. Reed stepped forward first and handed him a summary packet. Unauthorized execution of a defective warrant at the residence of Assistant United States Attorney Vanessa Cole. Evidence of internal leaks. Potential witness intimidation. Additional financial irregularities under review. Bennett read only the first page before lowering it. His face did not change, but the room felt older somehow. How many knew? He asked. Reed replied with equal calm. That is what we are determining. Bennett turned to Mercer. Did you approve this entry? Mercer lifted his chin. I approved lawful action based on probable cause. Vanessa spoke from the staircase landing where she had been listening unseen. Then your first false statement today was made before sunrise. Every head turned. She descended slowly, carrying another file. The warrant cited narcotics movement, digital evidence destruction, and immediate risk of flight. I was asleep, home alone, and under active federal protection. She handed the file to Bennett. You may also enjoy page 6. Bennett opened it and found months of internal complaints routed through Mercer's chain of command, each marked unresolved, delayed, or administratively closed. Holt stared at the floor. Several officers exchanged looks they had avoided for years. Bennett's jaw tightened. Why was I never shown these? No one answered because everyone knew the answer had many names. Outside, the morning broadcasts had gone live. Reporters now spoke directly into cameras while the broken front door framed the scene behind them. The image was too clean to deny, authority entering one way, accountability arriving another. Inside the kitchen, Reed received a text and nodded to two agents. They moved toward Mercer with formal restraint and clear words. Officer Daniel Mercer, you are being placed on administrative hold pending federal charges review. You are required to surrender department credentials immediately. Mercer looked to Bennett, waiting for rescue from the only ladder still visible. Bennett held his gaze for several seconds, then extended his hand. Badge, he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Mercer slowly unclipped the shield from his belt and placed it in the chief's palm. The small piece of metal made almost no sound, yet everyone in the house heard it. Holt closed his eyes. One patrol officer quietly removed his cap. Another turned away, ashamed to witness and ashamed to understand why. Vanessa watched without satisfaction. She had seen too much damage done by moments like this to confuse them with victory. Bennett slipped the badge into his coat pocket. Your service record bought you time, he said to Mercer. It did not buy you truth. Mercer's shoulders lowered for the first time all night. They wanted me, he muttered. No, Vanessa replied. They wanted honesty. You volunteered yourself. Reed directed agents to escort Mercer outside through the side entrance, but camera crews had already moved there too. There was no quiet path left. As Mercer stepped toward the door, neighbors who had once lowered their eyes now watched openly. Some said nothing. Some did not need to. Bennett turned to Vanessa. Counselor, on behalf of this department, she stopped him gently. Do not apologize to me first. She looked toward the lockbox on the table, then toward the street where witnesses once lived in fear. Apologize to everyone who never had cameras when it happened to them. The chief lowered his eyes. For the first time that morning, even Rank looked humbled. By 7:30, the street had become a lesson no academy could teach. Patrol vehicles were gone, replaced by city inspectors measuring the damaged doorway, federal sedans idling at the curb, and neighbors who no longer pretended not to notice what happened on their block. The rain had cleared. Sunlight touched the wet pavement and turned the night's chaos into something sharper, evidence in daylight. Inside the house, the command center was winding down. Devices were catalogued. Statements were signed. Officers were released in staggered silence, each leaving with the posture of someone carrying a private reckoning. Holt remained at the kitchen table long after the others had gone. His untouched bottle of water sat beside a legal pad covered in notes, names, and times. Vanessa entered carrying a small toolbox borrowed from Mr. Alvarez next door. She knelt by the broken hinge and began removing screws from the splintered frame. Holt rose immediately. Let me help, he said. She handed him the screwdriver without comment. For several minutes they worked in silence, one holding the frame steady while the other aligned the metal plate. The house sounded different now. No radios. No commands. Just tools, footsteps, and the ordinary labor of repairing what arrogance had damaged. Why are you doing this yourself? Holt finally asked. Vanessa tightened one screw and sat back on her heels. Because institutions apologize slowly, she said. Doors do not wait. Holt looked at the ruined wood. I gave a statement. I know. I named people. Good. He hesitated. It still feels like betrayal. Vanessa stood and brushed dust from her hands. Sometimes the system trains decent people to confuse exposure with betrayal. Holt lowered his head. I joined to help people. Then begin there, she replied. Outside, Chief Bennett addressed the press from the sidewalk. No podium. No backdrop. Just a microphone cluster and the truth standing too close to avoid. He announced immediate suspensions, an independent review board, and emergency witness outreach for anyone tied to Mercer's unit. Reporters shouted questions about race, selective raids, and sealed complaints. Bennett answered some, deferred others, and for once did not hide behind polished phrases. In the living room, Reed watched the broadcast on a tablet while agents packed equipment. "Public pressure moves faster than policy," he said. Vanessa carried the repaired hinge to the porch. "Then let it run ahead for once." Reed studied her for a moment. "You could have stayed under protection housing." "And miss the chance to see who kicked the door?" she asked. Reed smiled faintly. "You always were difficult to shield." A moving truck from a local contractor arrived with temporary replacement panels donated by 3 neighbors pooling money before sunrise. Mrs. Donnelly brought coffee. Mr. Alvarez brought fresh lumber. A teenage boy from 2 houses down asked if he could sweep broken debris from the entryway. The same street that watched in silence at 3 in the morning now moved with quiet purpose. Vanessa accepted every offer. No speeches. No grand gestures. Just people choosing better after seeing worse. Holt stepped onto the porch in plain clothes, having turned in the rest of his gear. "I resigned," he said. Vanessa looked at him carefully. "Resignation is not redemption." "I know." "Then earn the second one." He nodded and joined the teenager with a broom. By 9 o'clock, the doorway stood straight again, unfinished wood bright against old brick. It was not beautiful, but it was honest. Reporters still filmed from across the street, hoping for tears or triumph. Vanessa gave them neither. She set a new welcome mat at the threshold, smoothed it flat, and looked once at the cameras. "Some people break doors to feel powerful," she said. "Some people rebuild them so no one else has to." Then she stepped inside, leaving the house open to morning light. By noon, the story had moved far beyond Willow Creek Drive. It played on televisions in barber shops, courthouse waiting rooms, airport lounges, and office break rooms where people usually avoided talking about anything real. The same 30-second clip ran everywhere, flashing lights before dawn, a shattered doorway, federal agents arriving, and Chief Bennett standing stiff beside microphones while reporters asked questions he could not outrank. But clips only show impact. They rarely show weight. Inside the federal building downtown, Vanessa walked through security carrying the same briefcase she had packed the night before. Staff members who usually greeted her with casual nods now stepped aside in respectful silence. Some had heard what happened. Others had lived versions of it in smaller rooms with no cameras and no witnesses. A young clerk near the elevator whispered, "Glad you are here." Vanessa gave a slight nod and kept walking. In conference room for B, maps, charts, and case files covered the walls. Reed was already there with 3 prosecutors, 2 analysts, and a stack of overnight subpoenas. "We have 47 new calls," he said. "Former officers, clerks, dispatchers, civilians." Once Mercer fell, people started speaking. Vanessa set her briefcase on the table. "Fear is expensive to maintain," she said. "Once one person stops paying, others notice." Reed handed her a folder marked urgent. Inside were statements from witnesses whose names had been found in the lockbox. Several described traffic stops that became threats after they agreed to testify. Others described cases quietly disappearing when complaints named certain officers. Vanessa read each page without changing expression, but everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. "We move today," she said. "No delays. Freeze records. Protect witnesses. Expand review to every case touched by that unit." Across town, Chief Bennett sat before the city council under bright hearing room lights. Council members who had ignored warnings for years now demanded timelines and accountability with sudden passion. Bennett answered carefully, but every response was shadowed by one fact: the warnings had existed. They had simply been easier to shelve than solve. Outside City Hall, community leaders gathered on the steps with pastors, attorneys, and families carrying folders of old complaints. Some papers were faded from age. Some hands shook while holding them. None of them were silent anymore. Back at the courthouse, Holt waited outside Vanessa's office in a borrowed suit that did not fit quite right. He stood when she approached. "I brought more names," he said, handing over a notebook page. "Supervisors, overtime fraud, who approved selective patrol lists." Vanessa scanned it quickly. "This helps." Holt exhaled. "I keep thinking if I had spoken sooner, regret can be useful," she said, opening her office door. "If it pushes forward instead of backward." He looked at the city skyline through the hallway window. "Do people ever trust again?" Vanessa considered the question longer than he expected. "Some do. Some should not. Trust is not owed to uniforms or titles. It is earned in patterns." She stepped inside, then paused. "Help us change the pattern." By late afternoon, more warrants were signed. More offices were searched. More phones were surrendered. Reporters chased every update, but the real story was quieter than headlines: secretaries forwarding emails they once feared to send, detectives admitting files were altered, residents finally learning their complaints had not been imagined. As sunset painted the courthouse windows gold, Vanessa stood alone in her office and looked down at the city. Somewhere below, people were driving home, picking up groceries, helping with homework, living ordinary lives that depended on systems they should not have to study just to survive. Reed entered carrying coffee. "Long day," he said. Vanessa accepted the cup. "Necessary day." He glanced at her damaged knuckles from replacing the door hinge that morning. "You should rest." She looked out at the streets below. "Tomorrow people will call this justice," she said softly. "Tomorrow is paperwork. Justice is whether it still matters next month." 3 months later, Willow Creek Drive was quiet again. Lawns were trimmed. Mailboxes stood straight. Children rode bicycles in looping circles where news vans had once parked bumper to bumper. The temporary plywood at Vanessa Cole's front entry had long been replaced by a solid oak door with brushed steel hinges and a narrow glass panel that caught the morning sun. It was stronger than the one before, though she never spoke about that. Some lessons do not need captions. Inside the federal courthouse, the final hearing room was full before sunrise. Reporters filled the back rows. Community members lined the walls. Families who had carried old complaints for years sat shoulder to shoulder with young law students taking notes on history they had almost missed. Chief Bennett testified first, announcing permanent policy changes, outside oversight, mandatory warrant review reform, and witness protection procedures independent from local command. He spoke clearly, but everyone knew reforms sound best before they are tested. Then came the plea agreements, resignations, indictments, and restitution orders tied to Mercer's network. Money had moved. Records had disappeared. People had been targeted because they were easy to target. The machinery was larger than one officer, but one officer had been arrogant enough to expose the gears. Mercer entered last in a plain suit with no badge, no escort of admiration, and no place left to stand above anyone. He looked smaller than the headlines that once feared him. When asked if he wished to address the court, he cleared his throat twice before words arrived. "I made decisions I thought I could justify," he said. "I was wrong." It was the kind of apology that arrives only after options leave. Some in the room looked away. Others looked harder. Vanessa sat at counsel table, hands folded, expression unreadable. She had no interest in humiliation. Humiliation had built too much of this story already. When it was her turn, the room quieted in a different way. She stood, adjusted one page of notes, then set it aside unread. "This case was never about one night," she said. One night simply gave cameras to what many people had been describing for years. She turned slightly toward the gallery where families watched. Power often counts on isolation. It hopes each person harmed believes they are the only one. Accountability begins when people realize they are part of a pattern, not an exception. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. The judge asked whether she sought additional remarks regarding the unlawful entry at her residence. Vanessa glanced through the tall courtroom windows where sunlight touched the city beyond. "My door was repaired the same morning," she said. "Many others waited years for theirs to be heard. Focus on them." In the hallway afterward, microphones rushed toward her. Questions flew about politics, race, career plans, and whether she felt vindicated. She answered none of those first. Instead, she asked that witness assistance numbers be displayed on every screen in the building. Then she stepped outside into crisp autumn air where Holt waited near the courthouse steps in a municipal accountability office badge newly clipped to his coat. It was not glamorous work. It was real work. "We opened 17 new reviews this week," he said. Vanessa smiled faintly. "Good. Keep opening doors." Across the plaza, Mr. Alvarez and Mrs. Donnelly stood with dozens of residents who had come by bus from Willow Creek Drive. They waved like family who had chosen each other through circumstance. Vanessa crossed to them, shook hands, accepted hugs, and listened more than she spoke. The cameras captured that too, though it would never trend the way flashing lights did. As evening settled, she returned home and paused at the oak door before stepping inside. Her hand rested briefly on the handle. The street was calm. The windows glowed warm. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a siren passed and kept going. She opened the door and entered without fear. Because sometimes justice is not thunder in a courtroom. Sometimes it is the quiet sound of a lock turning in a house that finally belongs to peace.